I'm here today with Bethany, who I've known for a little while from an organization called Back to Jerusalem, which I figured you might want to find out more. So, hello, Bethany.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. First, right off the bat, just tell us what is Back to Jerusalem for people who've never heard it and think, okay, what's this Israel thing about? Because that's probably where the brain goes. What's Back to Jerusalem about?
It's funny, somebody at church the other week asked me how I was going on with working with the Jews in China. And I said, that's not it, but I see why you've come to that. So yeah, our focus is not Israel, it's not Jerusalem. Our focus is we work primarily with the underground house church of China. And so there are many underground believers inside of China. China will say that Christianity is illegal, and they have government registered churches that are called three self churches. But then there are underground churches inside of China that have 150 to 200 million people. We're not exactly sure on the exact number, but a lot. And so we work with them. There's a revival happening inside of China, has done for many years now. The numbers, even today, are around 28,000 people being saved inside of China every single day. Wow. And the unique thing about this revival is that there is a missionary call. And so 100 years ago, the Chinese church were given this vision by God to send Chinese into the most unreached area of the world. And that area happens to be between China and Jerusalem. And so the name comes from taking the gospel back to where it began in Jerusalem, from China to the most unreached area. Some people call it the 1040 window. We sometimes call it the land between the walls, the Great Wall of China, the Western Wall of Jerusalem. But that's where we have about 2/3 of the world's population and 9/10 of the world's unreached people groups. Wow. And so we are not the only ministry that carries the vision of Back to Jerusalem, because many people are working in this. Well, actually, not as many as there could be, but there are organizations working in this area. But we are one of those organizations, and we just try and support the Chinese however we can to get into these closed countries with the gospel.
Wow. Okay. That makes more sense. I mean, I knew of Back to Jerusalem. I was really privileged because we went to a church for the first time, moved into an area, and there was this guy called Brother Young coming. Okay, that's interesting. But we just read his book, and he just happened to be going to the church, and it was like, wow, because that was right at the very beginning. He hadn't been out of China long. So just because I'm talking to you and you know, but people probably don't. But what was the Brother Young thing? I mean, there's the book, The Heavenly Man. What was all that about?
The Brother Young thing, yeah. So there is a believer. He is a Chinese pastor, well, evangelist, Chinese pastor evangelist from a very rural area of China. And he was arrested for his faith inside of China. And he wrote a book about that called The Heavenly Man. And that came out in around 2003, 2, 3, 4, something around that, early 2000s. It might have been around that time that you visited this church, because he then started doing these meetings because the book just became so popular. So basically, there was a guy who had worked from kind of scribbles that Brother Yun had made of his story, and then there were interviews done properly to try and get this story together. It was never Brother Yun's idea. You know, he never came out of China and said, I want to make a huge international best-selling book about my story. But it so happened that God lined things up in a way that it naturally evolved. And that book became very well known. He is the only person that we know of that has ever left or has ever escaped China's maximum security prison. And so he is never allowed back inside of China because he's still wanted for escaping that prison. And we actually work with a pastor that now lives in the US. He's called the Billy Graham of China often. His name is Peter Shu. And he was in prison with Brother Yun at the time and watched him walk out. So we have eyewitnesses of that it really did happen, because there's been controversy, as with any testimony that becomes very popular, there is always going to be attacks and there's always going to be controversy. And we want to have discernment, you know, we want to be able to make sure that we're testing things. And does this sit right? And is the Holy Spirit saying something to me about this testimony? But we have corroborated his story through so many different means. And so he now lives in Europe and continues to share his testimony with as many people as he can.
testimonies, somebody once said, are so important because you can question all sorts of things, but you can't question someone's own story to destroy it. You can question it, but you can't question it so it's sort of reduced to nothing because it's their story, right? So you have to believe it. One way or another. You can either ignore it or you can believe it, but you can't really question it to nothing.
You can question theology. You can question, when people are making arguments for a faith or against a faith, you can do all of that questioning. But when someone has their own personal experience, it's very difficult to scientifically analyze that in the same way. So, I mean, I think of the verse, we overcome by the power of the blood and the word of our testimony. I mean, I think throughout the Bible, it becomes so clear how important our testimony is. And sometimes we forget. I mean, Brother Jan and his son, we just did several meetings in the UK with Isaac, his son. And I listened to Isaac share his testimony, which is phenomenal, every night. And I was blown away, and everybody there was blown away. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in these fancy messages and make sure we have those little catchy titles that can go on an Instagram reel and all these things, which are not always bad, but the Bible is very clear that our power comes from what God has done personally in our lives and the testimony that we all have.
Yeah, I was thinking because we got home from Big Church Festival here in the UK, which is not a conversation for today. That was amazing, but there was a letter ostensibly from our local brother who's a Jehovah's Witness. Now, it's clearly printed, it's been posted, that's fine. But what struck me was you're trying to do something that you can never do because Jesus already did it. So there is nothing you can do to do more or less than he's already done. And I think that's another testimony. But you think even the testimony of Jesus, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We've got 4 eyewitnesses. Yeah, it didn't really happen. But there were 4 people who saw it,
Yeah, absolutely. And all the people that witnessed this, I mean, Jesus appeared to so many people in those 40 days. And where was I? Was I reading something or watching something about, because of course, Islam, they always have these same arguments about the Bible's been changed or it didn't really happen. Oh, there's a guy called Stuart Keneatley or something. And I see his videos all over Instagram, and he has a YouTube channel. He's basically a pastor in the US that goes onto campuses at universities and debates with students. And he's so gifted, so incredibly gifted in the way that he's able to articulate, not in a got you kind of manner, but in a way that kind of really disarms the students and helps them to think differently. And he was just on a really big podcast. And that's where I heard it is these arguments that go back and forth. And how do you know Christianity is true? How do you know Jesus existed? And I mean, the death and resurrection of Christ is one of the most historically proven events in history. So you can argue what you like. There's so many things you can choose to argue if you really want, but that one doesn't really have any legs to it.
No, this is true. I read the book. I've not met Brother Yun, but I heard him talk, and all I thought was, this is a real man telling his real story. And I guess the problem is if you meet the guy and you hear him talk, you're going to see and feel little nuances of his conversation, and you're going to believe what he says because he's in your face, right? But if you've heard about somebody who's seen somebody who went to see him, all of a sudden you're not first person or even third person, you're like 10th person. Well, of course it sounds unbelievable, but miracles are by definition unbelievable.
Exactly. People always want to find an explanation or a way. And I think when somebody is raised up by God, and by God is the key word there, they are so much more visible to attack. Mm-hmm. And so in the early 2000s, Brother Yun had a very, very, very difficult time where, we'd be literally going to a church, and then the pastor would call and say, I'm really sorry. We've had someone contact us saying that Brother Yun's a fraud, and we don't want that in front of our congregation. And it's not the fact that we now can't have that meeting. It was the fact that this man who has given everything for Christ, who has been through the unimaginable, some you could say, if it's not irreverent, the closest thing to hell on earth, is now being told that his testimony is not even real. That's quite a difficult thing to contend with. And I can tell you that people in our team always get quite upset about that. And the one person who doesn't is Brother Yun. Mm-hmm. He smiles, he's gracious, he's kind. There have been instances where specific people have tried to go after him intentionally, quite high profile people, and he has defended them to people, and he has spoke kindly of them. And I think that's why he has seen so much of God's blessing and goodness and kindness to him, because he has such a gracious and forgiving heart. People can read his story and see him share on a stage and think, is he really like that? Is he just like that for an hour when he speaks on a stage? But I've traveled with him for days and days on end, and I know people that have known him for decades, and everybody has the same story. Even Isaac, his own son, that he is as gracious of a man, that just simply loves Jesus. That's it. It's not complicated. He simply loves the God he serves. And that's a wonderful thing. And when you're in that place and you know your relationship with God and you know your testimony, what people say, it bounces right off you, I think.
Which is coming back to what we said right at the start, that your testimony is your testimony. People can question it. And it's good to question. Do question. It should be. We should question, is God really real? Because that searching can be such a beneficial time, but you can't question someone's testimony to naught. There's a piece of scripture I love. You'll know them by their fruit. You'll know them by their action. What do they do? And I've always said to my own boys, someone can have a bad day, right? They can have a bad year, but what are they like, 6 months on, 9 months on? Are they, what's the consistency of that? Where are they now? Because we can have a bad moment. We can have a bad year. We can, have a broken leg and it's going to make us angry, which we wouldn't normally be because we're in pain. Okay. So what are they like 3 months later? Are they still angry without the broken leg? Okay, that's not great. Are they peaceful now? So that consistency comes from time, and you can't take a snapshot of someone and say, this is who they are.
It's not about perfection, like you're saying. We all have moments. Some of us, I can put myself on that pedestal, but we all have our moments, and I'm sure Brother Yanni is no exception to that. But as you say, it's the constant fruit, what comes out of them. And when you are pressed, when someone is attacking you, do you attack back or do you respond with grace and love? To me, that is the ultimate testimony of how you respond in those situations. And it's a blessing to be around the people that we work with, for sure.
I was thinking about Jesus on the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do. That's the perfect response, clearly, but that's what we all try to attain for, isn't it?
We do our best.
Yeah. So back to Jerusalem. Give us your story into back to Jerusalem. Where does faith begin for you? Is it, you've got loads of church back there. Is it kind of a radical? Mine's a much more of a slower progression to Christ. It wasn't anything kind of radical like my wife's would be, but what's your story into faith and then into back to Jerusalem?
Yeah, I probably have a slightly more similar story to you in that sense. I was raised by the most amazing parents, who gave me the most wonderful example of what it is to follow Christ. And my earliest memories are coming downstairs to get my breakfast for school, and my dad was sitting on the sofa reading his Bible every morning, and we would do devotions together as a family, which I hated as a kid, of course. Well, not of course, I'm such
no, I know what you mean.
Would like it, but I'd sit there, we'd finish reading the devotional, and then I'd be like, God, please don't let my dad pick me to pray. Please don't let him pick me to pray. But it trained something in me. Not brainwashed, that's a very, very different thing. It trained something in me. It trained a discipline in me that I witnessed. And so I was very, very blessed to grow up the way that I did. 2 amazing older brothers. And my first, also the middle child, my younger older brother, always wanted to be a preacher. From being young, he just was that. He's an evangelist, my brother, fiery, passionate, did have kind of a transformative moment, and has ever since kind of been running after Christ in that way, passionate about saving souls for God. And my oldest brother was into apologetics, super intelligent. He went to Oxford, did his master's, all of that stuff. And I kind of felt a little bit lost. I felt like I had a relationship with God. I loved God. I wanted to follow him, but I had no clue what he wanted to do with my life. And sometimes now I look back and wish that I had this story of being a little girl and saying, God, I want to go to China like Hudson Taylor did. That wasn't my story, unfortunately. I had a best friend growing up who wanted to be a missionary to Africa. And it just never interested me. My two oldest brothers, my dad actually took to Africa on missions trips with the church. My dad felt that was really important for them when they were both 16. And then when I was 16, he said, "Do you want to go?" And I was like, "Not really. I'm good. I have no desire to do that at all." And it felt like I was floating through life, really. And I liked English. I was good at it at school. And so I thought, well, I'll be an English teacher. So I went to university, and I'd heard a bit about Back to Jerusalem because my pastor at the time had agreed to start the UK office in the church there where we were at. We're in the north of England. And so I had heard somebody called Eugene Bach come and share about Back to Jerusalem, but I was 16, 17, 18. So I knew this guy came and shared once a year, and I didn't really pay so much attention beyond that. And then after my second year of university, my pastor came to me and said, "Hey, Bethany, we're looking for someone to go and teach English in China. There's a group of missionaries who are ready to be sent out to the mission field, but all they know is Chinese. And so we always do kind of a year of language study with them so they at least have a basic understanding of English, which of course is used pretty much worldwide. And would I be willing to go and teach for a few months?" And I said, "Well, can I think about it? Because I don't really want to do that." I'll say the right thing and think about it. And I came home, and my mum, who is very careful about her words and is one of those scary people, when they say something, it's probably true. She said, "Bethany, I don't know why, but you need to go to China." And I was like, "I don't feel that, Mum. Like, for what? There's no, to go for 3 months and then come back and finish my degree. What is that going to achieve?" And she said, "I don't know, but I feel it really strongly." And so I prayed about it, and I had that sense of, okay, I should go. And to be honest with you, I thought selfishly, this is going to be one of those times where I go and do something for God, and he reveals himself to me in a really big way. And I have a life-changing experience where Jesus appears to me, or Gabriel descends, super spiritual, and then I'm good. I didn't think it'd have anything to do with China at all. So I agreed to go. I was 19. Had never traveled abroad alone, let alone all the way to China by myself. And I was going for 3 months. And I cried all the way there. I think the air hostess, bless her, probably thought I was being trafficked or something horrible. And so I arrive in China. I don't know a word of Chinese. I land and I meet our friend there, who is amazing, but I did not know at the time very well. And actually, I think because I was so young, because it's the only time I think he's ever really done it, Eugene did come and meet me at the airport for 5 minutes and then left. But I did kind of have a familiar face. And I got there, and for the first 2 weeks, I lived with this older Chinese lady, because, long story, the apartment that we do the training in wasn't ready. And so for 2 weeks, I was like, "God, why am I here? I don't want to be here. It's hot. It's miserable. I don't understand what anybody's saying. I just want to be at home. I'm a homebody, I just want to be at home." I was trying to call my parents. The signal's not good. There's so many things happening. And I committed to 3 months, so I stuck it out. And I started teaching with the Chinese, and that was a real blessing because most of them were about my age. They were in their 20s. And kind of hearing their stories of being called to the mission field, how they'd come to know Christ, being in this underground training facility and experiencing what that was like. I was able to go to an underground church meeting every Sunday with these older ladies that kind of took me in, and that was a wonderful experience. I had an experience in the west of China near Tibet where a Buddhist monk cursed me, and I collapsed, and I almost went into a coma, almost died. And I have to say, that was, if I had to choose a pivotal moment in my life when we were talking about faith, that was it for me, because I was in the middle of nowhere, and there were several things that happened that were miraculous, really. And I was in this, I could call it a hospital, but it was a room with some medical equipment, basically. And I was lying there on the table and I was seeing all these kind of doctors frantically rush about me. And yet it was really quiet and calm inside of me. And I remember feeling like here in the middle of Tibet, without parents, without my brothers, without my pastor, without any church people around me, alone by myself, potentially about to die, do I believe in this whole Jesus thing? Like,
Wow.
is it real for me here now alone? You know, it's very easy when I go to church on a Sunday with my family. It's very easy when I'm on worship team singing and worshiping and I feel I love God. I feel I know God. But when you're in that moment completely alone and you feel that, okay, is this real for me? And I really had an experience with God that will never leave me. And it was, you don't want to sound flaky about it, but it felt transcendent. Like there was just this experience with Christ, his nearness, his presence that was like nothing I ever experienced. And even though that was wonderful, the experience was pretty miserable. And so I ended up getting back to where I was originally staying after this trip to Western Tibet and counting down the days to going back to England. I was ready to leave. Okay, I've had this experience with God. That was moving and wonderful. Now I'm ready to go home. And the second I came back to England, the moment within 2 or 3 days, I thought, I want to go back to China. It's like I left half of myself in China, you know, where it's like you come back so different because of God had done something in me that I did not even see, did not even recognize. He'd given me a heart for China without me even knowing it through quite a miserable 3 months. And I didn't want it. It's so interesting how God sometimes gives us a heart for things that we actually didn't want or didn't desire. And everything that I did was tinged with China. I started to read every book I could find about China. I started to listen to podcasts about China. And that's when I started to listen to the Back to Jerusalem podcast. Every single day I went back to episode 1. And sorry, I know I'm going on, interrupt at any moment. And after a few weeks, I was like, okay, God, I've got this burden. That's how it felt, this burden for China and this vision. But Back to Jerusalem cannot use me. I have nothing to offer. I have no missions experience. I can't speak Chinese. I have nothing to bring to the table. They're never going to want me, ever. So please, God, can I pray this China thing away like it never happened because I don't want it? That was my prayer for maybe a month every night. God, take this burden away. My parents begged me to graduate. And so I said, I'll finish my last year. I'll graduate and get my degree. And about a month in, because God is gracious and God is kind, he did not answer my prayer. And my pastor came to me and said, hey, I really need somebody to help with the admin in the UK office. I'm a pastor. I'm busy. There's emails. There's, mail to sort through. I was 20 now at this point. Would you be willing to do that? And it felt like a lifeline, like somehow God had taken all my insignificance, all the skills I didn't have, all the qualities I couldn't bring, and somehow managed to carve me out this tiny little role inside of this vision. And so I would skip university most days. My last year of university, I had a 30% attendance rate because I was just at the office all the time and consuming as much information as I could about Back to Jerusalem. And it was a growth that I can honestly say, hand on heart, I love this vision now more today, 7 years on, than I did that first day. It's grown. The more that I'm involved, the more privileged I feel. And after about 2 years, through a series of quite difficult circumstances, I ended up taking over the UK office and have been with the vision, the ministry ever since. But I have to reiterate always in my story that this is not something I asked for, that if God would have listened to me, if God would have followed the Bethany plan, Bethany, and we all say that we trust God and he orders our steps and his ways are better than ours. But so often we fight against it. So often we push against it because we can only see the next step, sometimes not even that. And if we could only see, if I could have seen 7 years on, I would have never prayed the prayers that I prayed. But by God's goodness, he ignored them and did exceedingly above what I could have ever asked.
you did not go on for too long. It's really, really. I'm finding it's touching my heart because of my own insecurities about stuff, and it's really encouraging to hear you saying what you said. But I'm reminded of Garth Brooks wrote a song. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers, and I guess for you that is something that you would say. Yes, I'm really glad that God didn't give me the Bethany plan, but gave me the God plan.
If someone said, "What are you most thankful for aside from salvation?" I would say that God did not answer my prayers. Absolutely. And I hope that I am more careful what I pray for now. But that's not true. I mean, I can name you so many instances in the past year that I prayed for things that I shouldn't have. But God is so good to us, and He requires that our heart is towards Him, and that ultimately we love and we trust Him, and He is forgiving in those times that we pray for the wrong things. And actually, don't tell God what you're not qualified for, because that's His decision. It's not yours. And you'll never, ever be qualified for what God has for you. None of us will ever be good enough for what the gifts that God bestows upon us. You and I were just talking earlier about the miracles God's done in your life and how you kind of feel overwhelmed with, God, I don't deserve all this goodness. And we don't. But He gives it to us anyway. And then we have to be responsible with those gifts that He's given to us.
Yeah, which I think is where I love the Back to Jerusalem heart, because it's not about building a ministry. It's not about building a bigger church or a bigger kingdom. And, growing up, big churches are so good for areas. I know people have their issues, or everything needs to be a small church, but larger churches also then can resource smaller churches. And our church was big in Wolverhampton, where I grew up, and we sometimes would send out, a couple of worship groups on a Sunday because other churches didn't have that, or we set out people to do welcome for them, So there's nothing wrong with big churches in that context. But I love the fact that Back to Jerusalem is about investing into, an area of land where, let's be honest, Christians are not really wanted.
No, the opposite. And just on that as well, there was something in the early days that actually Eugene really taught me, reprimanded me a little bit on, because in the early days, I was all about B2J and I loved Back to Jerusalem. And there were some of these bigger ministries, huge ministries, I should say, that didn't seem to have any focus on this 1040 window, the area between China and Jerusalem, at all. And I would become very frustrated with those organizations or ministries. And I would think, if you were really doing what God wanted you to do, you'd be focusing on the unreached. Have you never heard of the Great Commission? And my intentions were good. I was passionate about what God had called me to. But the wonderful thing about God is we're a body, and He calls us all to different things. And Eugene once said, there's small boats and there's big boats. And he calls it big boats, small boats ministry. And there are these big boats, these big ministries, and we're a small boats ministry. But the truth is, both are needed. The kingdom needs both. The kingdom needs people to focus on America. God needs people to focus on Europe. And He needs people to focus on the unreached and Asia and all those places. It's like if you go to a church, my dad's a pastor. And so I know that if you ask the Sunday school teacher, they'll say, this is the most important role in the church. We're raising up the next generation. It's the most important. And then you'll go and ask the worship leader, and they'll say, well, we host the presence of God, and it's really all about honoring God and worshiping. And then you'll go and speak to the guy that's gifted in teaching, and he'll say, if we don't teach the word, we'll have no foundation. Everybody feels that what they're called to is the most important thing. And I actually think that that's a really good thing. As long as you're not dismissing what other people do, if you can recognize that what everyone does is important. Of course, I believe that missions to the most unreached areas in the world is the most important thing in the world. Of course, I believe that, because that's the burden God's given to me. But I also believe the person next to me that wants to minister to the homeless and the broken and the trafficked in Rotherham, where I live, is just as important and just as valid. And so that is an important thing that I learned. And just like you said, the big churches, the small churches, be careful to criticize, because God uses all of us, and we're all needed. We can't all be the same, or we wouldn't be able to fulfill what God has for us. But yes, you're right. In the area between China and Jerusalem, not only are Christians not wanted, but severely persecuted. And 2 years ago, for the first time, we did something called a Voice of the Persecuted conference, where we had this idea, what if we brought together a group of people that had been in prison for their faith over a weekend to share their stories? And we did it in the US, and it went above and beyond anything that we could have thought. And so we're going to do it again this year in the US in October. And to hear the stories of people from Iran, Sudan, North Korea, China, people all over the world who have experienced suffering for their faith, the likes that we read of Paul in the Bible, that so many around the world today in the Western world have no idea is happening. I think it was talked about much more decades ago. In my parents' generation, they would say that that would be talked about a lot, the persecuted church. And for some reason, it seems to have fallen off the radar a bit. But it's such a blessing for us when people like yourself are not just interested, that's not a strong enough word, but have a heart to pray for the believers that are, Paul says we should remember those in prison as though we were there. That's a command that Paul gives us. And there are people suffering, as you and I speak today, for their faith. And I believe that the Church of Christ that is in much comfort has a responsibility to pray on their behalf.
I've read Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place. And prior to that, I was reading Brother Andrew from Open Doors. And there's two stories. One was Corrie ten Boom. I share this a lot because it really hits me, is when she's in one of the prison camps. And they have this, basically a church service. And there's Corrie ten Boom. I think it was a Greek Orthodox lady. And there's a Roman Catholic lady. And there's all these people from denominations that perhaps you would think, well, they're not real Christians. It's easy to say, well, Roman Catholics. And yet this lady brought her gift. And Corrie ten Boom says, isn't this probably what heaven's going to be like? Because we have this really narrow window of my Pentecostal church, my Baptist church, my Anglican church. This is what church is. Everybody else, you're stupid and wrong. But in that prison, when you simply have what you can bring, you have all these different people. And he said, surely this must be like heaven. But the other one that on the back of that one was from Brother Andrew, who was in this, basically a dead church. It was a government controlled church in, was it Azerbaijan or somewhere, Eastern Europe. And he said, don't ever, ever criticize God's church. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It's still the bride of Christ. And this church, then the Holy Spirit came in and it was like a fire. And it was a real lesson to him too. And he shares this in the book about, God's church is never dead. It may even look dormant to us. But like you said, we shouldn't criticize. But
Absolutely.
One more thing I thought was, he said people who joined his organization, it's like, if you're going to come in and then really criticize communism, then you're not equipped for the job. Our job is not to come in and, criticize the government. Our job is to reach the lost. And I guess that's something else Back to Jerusalem, where you say, please don't just pray against the government, but pray for the government, which again is a command, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's a learning curve that all of us at Back to Jerusalem are still on, because it is very hard for me to pray for President Xi. Like, that's not an easy thing, other than for his demise. Because when you hear so many stories, when you hear the policies that he continues to bring in year after year, and just stories that just anger you, and there is something in you. And sometimes sometimes Bethany can convince herself it's righteous anger, and maybe some of it is. But when you look to the Chinese, they will never speak that way about their government or pray for the demise of their government. Like you said, you pray that God's righteousness will prevail. You pray that evil will be dealt with. Absolutely. But yeah, they don't focus on the government's the problem, because they understand that it's spiritual. They understand that this is not about them and us, that actually they're lost. They need a savior like anybody else. Sometimes when you hear the stories of what these communist guards do to believers, or we have a book I just finished reading, actually, proofreading, that will be coming out within October, of somebody from Iran. And he was the first person to be put on death row for his faith after the Islamic Revolution. And the things that they did to him in that prison, I mean, in my mind, it's like that man has to be the devil incarnate to do something like this to a man. But the truth is, it's spiritual. That man is in chains as much as the next person. He's spiritually bound as much as the next person. And the truth is, Christ died for him the same way that he died for you and I. Christ died for Kim Jong-un the same way that he died for you and I. And so it's something that I have to pray, God, give me a heavenly perspective. Help me to see people the way that you do. Because in my naturalness, in my flesh, I often want to point to the person and not the spiritual reality.
In the UK, the general election has been called. With what you know, your heart, passion, your understanding of working with Chinese in particular, which is obviously a communist government, how would you help Christians in the UK to pray? Because my thing is, here we go again. It's going to be polarized. You vote Conservative, you're evil. Vote Labour, you're evil. And it's just, can we get beyond polarized political opinion, which is what we see even more, obviously, in extreme in the US? How would you encourage people to pray as we go towards a general election here in the UK?
Don't take political advice from me, is my first point. But you're not asking for that, and that's not what I'm going to give. I think that an element of the church, or a responsibility that the church is not fulfilling in the way that I think that it could, is that the church influences culture. The church should influence society, and the church should influence government. I mean, I watched that movie recently. Is it called, I think it's called Amazing Grace, is it? The one about Wilberforce. And everything that he went through in order for slavery to be abolished in the UK. And that was born again believers that loved God, that decided to look at government and not look at it politically, but to look at it spiritually, and not think who's in power, which party's in power. And do I think we should vote? I do. I think votes are important. If God tells you not to vote, I believe that that's also a possibility. I don't think that God's saying you always have to vote left or right. I think in the UK, we're a bit more open to that idea than our friends across the pond. But I do believe that, so my prayer is that God, whoever gets into power, whoever is voted in, it doesn't matter in that sense. What matters is that it's the church that is influencing politics. That would you raise up people in universities, God, that are people who love you, that know your voice, that have a heart for your people, that love your church, that will carry that into parliament, that will carry that into government. And so I can't say what people should vote. I can't say that you should pray one party gets in over the other. I don't know that it works that way, because you would have a hard job explaining why the Taliban took over Afghanistan and why Kim Jong-un is in power and President Xi will be in power forever. I pray that the church will influence politics in every arena, and that the people who God has called to do that will have that burden and be raised up in that.
I remember Andy Hawthorne from the Message Trust in Manchester. I saw him as a video of him speaking at a prayer breakfast for MPs a few years ago. And it was one of the words that he said, which I just thought, wow, that's true. Is we always pray for God, to work through us. We want God to do stuff through what we do, I guess, because we want our ministry, our vision, our calling to be seen. But he said, God, do work through us, but do a work in us. And I think that would maybe some of what you were saying, my own perspective of, rather than saying, okay, vote the Tories, vote the Labour, vote Green, don't vote independent. Actually, let's pray for people who are making these policy decisions to know Jesus Christ. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter what colour of party they are, we want them to know Jesus, because that, as Andy Hawthorne would say, that is the bit that changes society.
And whichever party you think leans more towards Christian values or not, vote for that, great, fantastic. But ultimately, if it's being led by people that don't know Christ, the outcome's going to be the same. We're still going to end up in a society that has completely forgotten God, that has lost our respect for the believers that went before us. I think in the church, this is such a huge gap as well, that we forget that there's a whole lines of generations that have gone before us, and we stand on those shoulders, and we're blessed because of that. And so, yeah, my prayer is that not just that we use our vote to try and steer the country towards Christ, but we pray that believers will be planted in politics, and are able to steer our nation.
Amen. I just thought I'd tackle the general election because it's kind of in the thing. And walking around a big church festival, I heard the odd people, "Oh, great, now we can do this," or "Oh no, it's going to be that." And I just think the problem is it's spiritual battle, and this is another opportunity where we can be polarized into these two camps that look at each other and hate each other. And we're not supposed to be centered around politics or party politics or anything else. We're supposed to be united by our shared love of Jesus Christ, which is what Brother Yun has and shares, and influences the people around him. And it's what comes out through what you say, and it's what we should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, even with the Israel-Hamas conflict that's happening right now, which is heartbreaking on every front, as far as I'm concerned. Somebody asked Brother Yun, who not whose side are you on, of course, but what would you do? What do you think that believers should do? And ultimately, his answer was, for messengers of the peace, of the good, carriers of the peace, and messengers of the good news of the gospel, to be able to, because while ever there are people that do not know Christ, they will continue to do evil. Not because even that they want to. I mean, of course, they give in to their own desires, but it's ultimately because they're blind. Their eyes have been blinded. And especially in the Middle East, I have to remind myself of this, because it can be, the stories that you can hear coming out of Afghanistan, for example, are so heart-wrenching. And you think, how can these people be so evil? And the reality is they need Christ. The whole reason that we started developing an e-Bible that we ended up using in Iraq when ISIS invaded is because Eugene traveled to Iraq with a Chinese pastor. And Eugene always jokes that there's a lot of things he wanted to drop on ISIS, and Bibles was not one of them. But he was talking about what they could do in the region. And this Chinese pastor said, "Why is no one trying to take the gospel to ISIS? We can talk about stopping them and supporting the church, and all of that's good, and supporting the people that are being persecuted, believer or non-believer, the people that are suffering. We're supposed to do that. But someone has to take the gospel to the people in power, even to the people that we might see as being evil, because it's spiritual, ultimately."
Bethany, thank you. I could sit and chat to you all day about this. Really quickly, DingDash, let's just quickly share that, because that's how I really got to know you a little bit better. Just tell us really briefly, what's DingDash all about?
Yeah, I know. I wish I'd have been on there a little bit more recently. But yeah, we started DingDash when things started to go downhill, particularly after the 2016 election in the US, where it seemed like social media was being restricted at every turn. And there was no platform for free speech, where a lot of Christian values, where people shared them on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it was, that their accounts would be blocked or shut down. And so we saw a need for a social media platform that works a bit like Twitter, I suppose, is the closest, that people could use for free speech, but also that it would be a platform that believers in closed countries could use. So where people like in China that are not able to get on Facebook or Twitter, that there would be a social media platform that they could use to connect with other believers around the world. So yeah, that's dingdash.com. It was actually a beautiful community that started on there. And there's people on there like yourselves that I feel like I know purely from DingDash. And I know your family, and there's so many others on there I could name where little things about them, and we encourage each other and build each other up and pray for each other. And yeah, it's a blessing to be over there.
Yep, dingdash.com, definitely something I would recommend you go and look up. It is social media, but it's not like you might think, in all the best possible good ways. So yeah, go and check out dingdash.com. How can people find out more about Back to Jerusalem? What's the website that people can get to see what's going on?
Yeah, the best way is backtojerusalem.com. If you wanted to send an email to me, if you have any questions, it's officeuk@backtojerusalem.com. You can send an email there, or you can visit our website. We have a YouTube channel. You can find us everywhere under Back to Jerusalem.
Fantastic. Bethany, thank you. I've been wanting to talk to you for ages about what you do, because you probably don't fit the profile of what we might think of somebody who works with Chinese missionaries. And now I even understand more of why I think that. And it absolutely makes me think that's why God chose you, because you didn't have what you needed, because God did.
You're so right. Yeah, I think that all of us can attest to that in some way, that God's strength is made manifest in all of our weaknesses, and we all have many of them.
There's a scripture that I misread for years. I guess we all do this. It was, when I am weak, I am strong. And it took me years to realize it's not when I'm weak, I'm strong. It's when I'm weak, then I am strong. And I've missed that middle word, because it's in my weakness, God's strength is manifested. And the weaker I become, the more of him there can be, because the less of me there is in the way. And your story today really is just putting highlighter pen all over that, I think, for me.
Yeah, no, I thank you for having me on. It's gone so quick. It feels like 10 minutes, but thanks for having me on. I've loved it.
Thank you, Bethany. And again, website backtojerusalem.com if you want to find out more about what they're about. Is Heavenly Man, is that available on the website as well?
That's easier to get on Amazon. You can pick it up for a few pounds.
Definitely recommend getting that book. I'm reading it as I speak. Well, not now, I'm talking to you, but it's on my bedside table reading, because it's one of those books where I love. It's not, let me rephrase that. It's not a story I love to read, because it's quite horrible most of the time, but I love the interwoven through all the hardship is God's peace, God's grace, God's goodness, God's provision, God's kindness. All the fruit of the Spirit is interwoven into some pretty evil stuff and cruelty. And having seen Brother Young, yeah, I would say he's the real deal.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Bethany. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Pure 24/7 radio is listener supported, which means we are free, online and always pure because of the generous support of our listeners. If you would like to contribute financially, please visit pure247radio.org. If you'd like to find out how we use your money, please visit the Our Cost section. Any donation of any size will help keep us on air and broadcasting for free. Thank you.